The memory that won't leave me is of a room with no windows lit by one low humming bulb swinging just enough to make the shadows breathe. There was a metal table shoved against a damp concrete wall, its surface streaked with rust and something darker that no one wanted to name out loud. On that table lay a folded map, the paper curled at the edges, a dozen red circles bleeding through like old wounds that never quite healed. A hunting knife sat beside it, the handle worn smooth initials scratched by hand into the side, catching the light every time the bulb swayed. The air down there felt heavy, wet, full of clay and cold iron, like the earth itself was holding its breath. Boots scuffed quietly on packed dirt, radios whispering someone clearing their throat just to push back the silence. I remember my own fingers on that map, the grit of it, the way the ink had bled where sweat or rain had touched it, and the sudden realization that I had seen that knife before in a very different kind of light. Even now, when it's quiet and the house is still, I can hear that bulb buzzing in the dark like a trapped insect that never finds a way out. Let me know where you're listening from and hit follow if you think remembering is its own kind of justice. Back then, before any of that life in Mason Ridge moved at a slow, familiar pace that felt to me almost comforting in its predictability. Mornings started with the sound of trucks on gravel engines rumbling as people headed out toward the poultry plants, the logging roads, or the highway that led to bigger towns most of us never bothered with unless we had to. In late August, the air carried that heavy, wet heat that stuck to your skin, and the smell of cut grass and distant wood smoke drifted in through our open windows because our old house didn't hold air conditioning very well. From our porch, you could see the dark line of the Ozark National Forest rising up at the edge of everything, a wall of green that looked soft and inviting when the light hit it right, and like something else entirely when storms rolled over it at dusk. I did my design work at the kitchen table with a fan buzzing at my ankles while Daniel sat beside me with a notebook open, scribbling ideas for lesson plans or jotting down notes for his next blog post about salamanders, hawks, or some obscure plant growing along a creek bed. We were ordinary in all the ways that count same grocery store, same gas station, same Friday night pizza. But that line of trees at the edge of town had always been the one thing that made our world feel bigger than it looked on a map. Daniel loved those hills in a way that was part science and part something else, something bordering on devotion. He'd come home from school with chalk dust on his sleeves and stories about how his students reacted when he showed them photos of bear tracks or owl pellets, his hands moving in the air as if he could pull those woods right into our little dining room. The smell of dry erase markers still clung to him when he dropped his bag by the door, and underneath that, I could catch the faint scent of pine and sweat from the afternoon he'd spent walking the edges of a new trail after class. He wasn't reckless. That was important to me. His compass and gear were organized, his routes logged in a notebook he kept on the shelf every outing, written in neat handwriting with dates, weather, and backup plans. At night, when the cicadas screamed outside and the house creaked as it cooled, he'd sit on the floor with his back against the couch laptop balanced on his knees, editing photos of mushrooms or animal prints, the glow of the screen soft against his face. I used to watch the way his expression changed when he shifted from grading papers to studying a picture of some half-hidden paw print, how the tiredness in his eyes would give way to a focused, almost childlike curiosity. Ethan Ward was different, though his world overlapped with Daniel's in the woods. Where Daniel saw the forest like a vast outdoor classroom, Ethan moved through it like it was a second home he never quite left, even when he was standing in his cramped workshop on the outskirts of town. You could always smell the place before you saw it, sawdust solvent a dry, almost sweet musk from the hides he worked on, and the buzz of his old fluorescent lights spilled out into the gravel driveway whenever you pulled up. He was 29 then, with calloused hands, and that slow, careful way of talking people around here get when they've spent more time listening to the wind than to other voices. The first time Daniel took me there, Ethan barely looked up from the deer mount he was working on his fingers, smoothing fur. moving with a practiced tenderness that surprised me. A radio hummed low in the background, some country station half lost in static, and through the open back door I could see the dark line of trees pressing close behind the property. When he finally did glance our way, he didn't smile so much as nod, eyes flicking briefly to me and then back to Daniel, as if he'd already placed me as someone who belonged more to his friend's world than to his own. For a while our lives braided together in small, ordinary ways. On early Saturday mornings, before the sun had burned the fog off the fields, I'd hear Daniel moving around the kitchen, the clink of the coffee pot, the scrape of gear being gathered from the hall closet. Sometimes Ethan's old pickup would rumble into our driveway headlights, cutting across our front room, and I'd see his silhouette through the screen door, cap brim, low arms folded as he waited. The smell of coffee leather and cold morning air would rush in when Daniel opened the door, and I'd stand there barefoot on the wood floor watching them trade quick, quiet jokes about who had forgotten what last time. They were careful but relaxed, like men who understood the woods and respected them but didn't quite fear them, not yet. Before they left, Daniel always leaned in to kiss my cheek, the stubble on his jaw rough against my skin, and he'd say something small and steady like, "Back this afternoon, or I'll text if we stay out longer." Those words felt like habit more than promise, the kind of everyday reassurance you don't think twice about until you lose it. Mason Ridge itself had the kind of rhythm older listeners will recognize even if they've never set foot in Arkansas. Afternoons were marked by kids biking down cracked streets, the rattle of loose chains, and the slap of flip-flops on hot pavement. The grocery store freezer doors squeaked when you pulled them open, and the cashier knew not only your name, but which week you usually bought flour or dog food. On summer evenings, screen doors popped open and shut as people stepped onto porches to watch storms build over the tree line, the sky turning bruise purple above the forest before the first crack of thunder shook the air. Our neighbor across the street, an older man with a faded Marine Corps cap, watered his lawn with a stubborn devotion while his old radio played ball games I never fully followed, but always heard. There was comfort in knowing where every sound belonged. A particular truck's muffler, the clank of the ice machine at the gas station, the whistle of a train miles away. When you live in a place like that long enough, you start to hear any new sound as an interruption, like a question you can't quite make out. That summer, Daniel's focus shifted to one story that had been floating around town for years, a dark bear bigger than it should be seen in the hills above Mount Magazine. Hunters at the diner told it with that half-serious tone that leaves you unsure whether they're teasing or testing you. Somebody always knew somebody who had seen it, a shadow moving on a ridge at dusk, a shape slipping between trees near a creek, prints deeper and broader than the others. Daniel didn't treat it like a campfire tale. He treated it like a puzzle. I remember the smell of pencil shavings and coffee as he leaned over the kitchen table one night tracing lines on a topographic map with his finger, explaining elevation and wind patterns like I was one of his students. His eyes had that bright, faraway look they got when the woods were calling to him, and the edge of the map fluttered in the breeze from the fan, making the whole thing seem somehow alive. I watched him circle a drainage and write a date in the margin, and I felt this odd blend of pride and unease. Pride that he cared so much about something, unease that whatever it was he cared about lived in a place we could only see from far away. Ethan's version of the story was rougher, less polished. One evening, while Daniel and I sat in his shop passing around a bottle of cold soda, Ethan stood by the back door looking out toward the trees like he was measuring something only he could see. The air smelled like rain that hadn't fallen yet, thick and metallic, and lightning flickered somewhere deep in the clouds beyond the ridge. Without turning around, he said quietly that some things in those woods didn't like being tracked, and that there were places where the ground remembered what had happened there too well. He never called it superstition, but he didn't call it science either. Daniel rolled his eyes in that playful way he had, nudging him and asking if he was really scared of an overgrown raccoon. Ethan didn't smile. He just shrugged, wiped his hands on a rag, and muttered that game wasn't the only thing that used old paths. Then he changed the subject to ammo prices, as if he regretted letting the thought out at all. I remember the way the wind pushed at the door just then, making it groan in its frame, and how the hair on my arms lifted even though it was still hot. In those weeks leading up to the trip, little details piled up around me that I didn't recognize as important until much later. Daniel started spending more nights at the computer, not just editing photos, but combing through obscure forums about trail conditions and old maps of the Ozarks. The glow of the screen painted his face a pale blue, while the rest of the room stayed dark and the whir of the fan was the only sound underneath his quiet typing. I began to notice faint circles under his eyes in the mornings, as if his mind wasn't shutting off even when his body finally gave in to sleep. His blog post drafts grew more reflective, almost poetic, talking about how the forest closed ranks around a person deeper and how the sound of your own footsteps could start to feel like someone else's. When I teased him about getting dramatic, he laughed and said it was just writing, just a way to keep his students interested. But there were moments when he'd fall silent mid-sentence, listening to something only he could hear in his memory. The air inside the house felt thicker on those nights, like the humidity had crept right through the walls and settled in our lungs. I kept my own routines as steady as I could. 3 afternoons a week, I taught a small art class for retirees at the community center, the scent of tempera paint and old linoleum filling the room, while we talked about grandkids' recipes and how the summers seemed hotter than they used to be. A few evenings a week, I drove down to the river overlook just outside of town. Windows rolled down so I could smell mud and algae and that faint, almost sweet scent of decaying leaves along the bank. Cars rarely passed once the sun started dropping, and the buzz of cicadas in the trees along the water was loud enough to fill the space where my thoughts would have been. Sometimes, if the clouds were low enough, I could see the storm line hovering over the dark strip of forest on the far ridge, like a bruise spreading slowly across the sky. I told myself that as long as the familiar sounds remained, cicadas, river water slapping gently at the rocks, a distant dog barking back toward town, then everything in my life was still where it was supposed to be. 2 nights before Daniel left for what he still called just a 2-day hike, we sat on our front steps with a pair of cheap lawn chairs pulled close together, the wood still warm under our bare feet. It was late enough that most of the neighborhood had gone quiet, just the occasional swish of a car passing on the main road, and the soft click of someone's porch light turning off one by one up the street. He had his notebook resting on his knee pen tucked behind his ear, and he talked about the melanistic bear again, about how rare those sightings were, and how a clear photograph could help document the population. Fireflies blinked lazily in the yard, their little green lights rising and falling like slow breathing. I remember asking if he really needed to go that far in with just one other person, and he answered me in that gentle, steady tone that always made me feel a little foolish for worrying. He reminded me of the extra batteries, the backup GPS, the printed maps, the weather forecast. He had thought of everything. At least that's what I believed then. When he reached over and squeezed my hand, his palm was warm and a little rough from chalk and rope, and for a moment the distant line of trees felt less like a threat and more like a promise. The night before they left, he laid all his gear out on the living room floor like he always did, each piece placed carefully in its own little space. Stove, fuel lantern, compass, knives, spare socks rolled tight. The overhead light buzzed softly, and shadows from the ceiling fan turned every object into something slightly more dramatic than it really was. I padded around barefoot, gathering the last bits of laundry from the back of the couch and pretending not to hover. Ethan dropped by to go over the plan one last time, leaning against the doorframe with his arms crossed, the smell of gasoline and cold air clinging to his jacket. They talked in that shorthand friends have about trailheads, ridgelines, and the best place to park so the truck wouldn't be in anyone's way. Every now and then, I caught a phrase, steep section, loose rock, old washout, and felt a small, tight knot form in my stomach, even as they brushed those details off with easy confidence. When Ethan left, he gave me a brief nod, almost respectful, like he understood I was offering up something precious and fragile, but that there were no words to make that sound less dramatic. On the morning they drove out, the sky over Mason Ridge was that washed-out gray-blue. You get right before the sun decides whether it's going to bake the town or hide behind clouds all day. The air smelled like wet pavement and gasoline as we stood by the curb, Daniel's pack already strapped into the bed of Ethan's old truck. At Bud's Quick Mart down the road, I knew the coffee was just starting to burn on the warmer, and someone was flipping the open sign while the first regulars pulled in for cigarettes and breakfast biscuits. Daniel hugged me with one arm, the canvas of his pack rough against my cheek, and told me not for the first time that it was just 2 nights that cell service might be spotty, but he'd text if he could. I remember the way the truck's tires crunched across the gravel as they pulled away, the tail lights small and red against the growing light, and how the sound of the engine faded into the low hum of morning traffic and birds in the trees. When I went back inside, the house still smelled like his aftershave and the coffee we hadn't quite finished, and a little trail of damp footprints from where he'd come out of the shower was drying on the hallway floor. That evening the heat finally broke, and a thin, cool breeze slipped in through the window screens, carrying the scent of rain from somewhere up in the hills. I made a simple dinner for one, listening to the distant rumble of thunder and the soft hiss of tires on the wet blacktop outside. My phone sat on the table beside my plate, the screen dark, a faint smudge of my fingerprint across the glass where I'd checked it one time too many. I told myself it was early, that they were probably setting up camp by a creek or arguing over which ridge to climb in the morning, that no news was exactly what I should expect. Still, as the sky over the forest turned from gray to deep blue and then to a solid starless black, I found myself drifting back to the front door more than once, opening it just enough to let the night air in and listening to the hush that had settled over our street. The porch light spilled a pale circle onto the steps, moths flickering through it, and I left it on longer than I usually did without really knowing why. By the time the second night fell, the house had settled into that familiar rhythm it always had when Daniel was away, quiet corners, the soft whir of the old fan in our bedroom, the faint glow of the porch light spilling across the front steps. I told myself not to check my phone again, but the screen lit up every time I walked past the table, catching my eye like it was trying to remind me of something. He'd said reception would be spotty. He'd said not to worry. Still, when I finally picked it up and saw nothing, no message, no missed call, the silence pressed in a little differently than it had the night before. It felt heavier, like the air before a storm. I tried to distract myself the way anyone would. Washed the dinner dishes, wiped the counter twice, even though it didn't need it, folded the blanket on the couch so neatly it looked staged. But the sound of distant thunder kept rising and falling, and every time the house creaked with the shift in humidity, I caught myself holding my breath. Around 10, I stepped outside just for the cool air, letting the screen door settle shut behind me. The street was empty, the kind of empty where even the dogs didn't bark. Just the hum of my porch light and the low whisper of wind moving through the big maple tree across the yard. I remember telling myself out loud, just to break the silence, that they were probably setting up for the night. That maybe the storm had caught them in a low valley where cell signals died. Daniel always left a lantern burning, just a small one, whenever they camped. I pictured its glow against a tent wall somewhere deep in the woods, imagined the two of them laughing about how I'd be pacing the kitchen floor. That image held me together long enough to go to bed. By morning, the air had turned cool and sharp, that early autumn bite you feel when the seasons can't quite decide what they're doing. The fog sat low over the neighborhood, softening the outlines of mailboxes and driveways. I made coffee, checked the phone again, still nothing. It was unusual, yes, but not unheard of. Daniel had spent whole weekends without service before. My worry stayed quiet, tucked somewhere near my ribs, but it was there. Around 11, Ethan's sister called. I remember her voice because she tried so hard to sound casual, like she was just checking in, but every word had a little tremor under it. Ethan was supposed to swing by their parents' place on the way home. Just a quick hello, nothing formal. He never showed. She asked if I'd heard from Daniel. I told her no, but that I wasn't concerned yet, not really. We'd give it time. They probably stayed out an extra night. Maybe they found something interesting. By late afternoon, the confidence behind those words had thinned to almost nothing. I kept checking the window every time a car drove past, half expecting to see Ethan's old pickup turn onto our street with the familiar rattle in its engine, but it never appeared. The sun drifted lower, throwing long shadows across the living room floor, and every one of them felt like a reminder that I was still waiting. I finally called Daniel's phone. It rang once and went straight to voicemail. That tiny detail, that single ring, sent a cold ripple through me. His battery was either dead or turned off, and neither one made sense. He always brought 2 power banks. If one failed, the other was ready. He'd never turn the phone off, not on a hike, not when he knew I was home waiting. I told myself to stop imagining the worst. People lost track of time in the woods. Maybe they took the long way back. Maybe they'd return after dark, apologizing for worrying me. But the denial didn't hold the way it had that morning. My hands shook when I poured more coffee, and I spilled a little on the counter. The smell of it mixed with the faint scent of rain drifting through the cracked kitchen window, and for a moment I just stood there staring at the cup, trying to breathe evenly. Near dusk, I drove out to Bud's Quick Mart. I told myself it was just to pick up a few groceries, but the truth was, I needed to feel closer to where they'd started. The gravel crunched under my tires in that familiar, uneven rhythm, and the yellow lights over the pumps flickered the same way they always did. Inside, the air smelled of old coffee and motor oil. The cashier, a young man with tired eyes, recognized me right away. He'd seen Daniel and Ethan 2 mornings earlier, told me they were in good spirits, said they'd bought a couple of energy bars and joked about chasing myths through the mountains. When I asked if he'd seen them come back through, he shook his head slowly. No, he said, not that he'd noticed. And something in the way he said it, soft, uncertain, made my stomach tighten. I stood at the edge of the parking lot for a long time afterward, watching cars pass on the highway, listening to the faint hiss of tires on asphalt. The wind coming off the forest carried the cool smell of pine and wet leaves. It should have been calming. Instead, it felt like standing too close to something vast and indifferent. I called Daniel's phone again. Voicemail. I tried Ethan's. Nothing. On the drive home, the sky deepened into a smoky blue, and the silhouettes of the hills rose like dark walls on the horizon. My headlights swept across empty fields and fence posts, and every shadow seemed to move just a little too slowly before settling again. When I pulled into our driveway, the porch light was still glowing, casting a pale circle on the steps. I'd left it on the night before. I left it on again. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I lay in bed listening to the fan whir through the darkness, its rhythmic clicking as it rotated. My mind kept looping through possibilities, small ones at first, like a sprained ankle or a dead battery. But as the hours stretched, stranger fears crept in from the edges, the kind you say out loud just to hear how ridiculous they sound. I didn't want to give them shape, didn't want to let them root. By 2 a.m, I was sitting at the kitchen table, elbows on the worn wood, staring at the map Daniel had left folded beside his gear bag. The paper felt cool under my fingertips. There were circles he'd drawn along the Bear Hollow Trail, little notes in the margins about elevation changes and old logging paths. His handwriting looked steady and sure, and for a moment I closed my eyes and tried to imagine his voice explaining those notes to me. But all I could hear was the hum of the refrigerator and the faint rustle of wind through the oak tree in the yard. When dawn finally broke, the sky was a pale, washed-out pink, the kind that makes the world look fragile, like it's made of thin paper. I made more coffee, paced the kitchen, checked my phone again and again. Still nothing. The worry had grown into something sharper now, something that pressed against my ribs every time I tried to breathe normally. I told myself I'd wait until noon. If I hadn't heard anything by then, I'd call someone. 11:30 came. No call, no text, just a lingering silence that felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. I finally dialed Sheriff Linda Harrow. My voice sounded small to my own ears as I explained that Daniel and Ethan were overdue by a full day, that they hadn't contacted anyone, and that their families were starting to worry. She listened quietly the way she always did and told me she'd look into it. Not to panic yet. People lost track of time out there. Maybe they took an extra trail. Maybe they'd pop up at the ranger station by afternoon. For a moment, that steadied me. Sheriff Harrow had a way of speaking that made you believe things were manageable. But when I hung up the phone, a knot of unease still sat heavy in my chest. Around 1, I drove out toward the trailhead myself. The farther I went, the thinner the traffic became until it was just me on that narrow road winding through the pines. The sun glimmered off the hood of my car, and every roadside ditch held rainwater from the night before. When I reached the gravel lot at Bear Hollow, the sight of Ethan's truck hit me harder than I expected. It sat there alone, dust clinging to its sides, the morning light catching on the silver paint. I got out slowly, the gravel crunching under my shoes, the cool breeze lifting my hair. The truck was locked. No mud on the tires that shouldn't be there, no signs of a struggle, nothing to hint at what direction they might have gone, just the empty space where 2 men should have returned. I ran my hand along the door, feeling the warmth of the metal from the sun. Inside, I could see a folded map on the seat, a thermos and the handle of Ethan's hunting knife still in its sheath, like they'd left everything just as it should be. A logbook hung near the trailhead, its pages flipping slightly in the breeze. I traced their entry with my eyes. 2 names, the date, a simple note, 2-day hike. The ink already looked older than it should have. Something inside me shifted then. Not panic, not yet, but a hollow pulse of dread, as if the forest itself were holding its breath, waiting for me to catch up to what it already knew. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the faint rustle of leaves high above and the occasional crack of twigs deeper in the trees. Each sound felt amplified, like the woods were rearranging themselves while I watched. I tried calling Daniel's name once quietly, not expecting an answer. The sound of my own voice startled me. It disappeared into the trees too quickly, swallowed by something vast and indifferent. By the time I got back to town, the sun was dipping low, turning the windows of houses along Main Street into squares of amber light. People were moving through their routines, picking up kids, mowing lawns, locking up the post office for the evening. But when I walked into my house again, the quiet felt different. Too thick. Too settled. I stood just inside the doorway, my keys still in my hand, listening to the hum of the porch light. A few minutes later, the soft crunch of gravel outside made me turn toward the window. A sheriff's cruiser eased into the drive, headlights dimmed. The engine clicked as it cooled, and then the driver's door opened. Sheriff Harrow stepped out slowly, the brim of her hat tipped low, and for a long moment she didn't move toward the house at all. She just stood there in the fading light, one hand resting on the door like she was gathering the right words before she spoke them. The sheriff stood there in the fading light for what felt like a full minute before she finally walked toward the porch. Her boots pressed softly into the gravel, each step slow, deliberate, like she already knew something neither of us wanted spoken aloud. When she reached the bottom step, she took off her hat and held it against her hip. That small gesture, gentle, respectful, sent a cold stillness through me. It marked the shift from private worry to something larger, heavier, the kind of moment that bends the path of a life in a direction you never imagined you'd have to walk. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. She told me they were officially overdue, that no messages or check-ins had come through any ranger stations, and that she'd already alerted a deputy to drive out to the trailhead. Her words were calm, practiced, shaped by a lifetime of delivering hard news in soft tones. She asked for the details, what time they left the gear they carried the route Daniel had mentioned. I answered as steadily as I could, but my fingers kept curling into the fabric of my shirt as if holding on to something would help the ground stay steady beneath me. By the next morning, our quiet street was lined with county trucks and SUVs. Engines hummed low in the cool air. Radios chirped clipped phrases, and the smell of gasoline and damp earth drifted between the houses. The sun was just beginning to climb over the trees, painting the tops of the pines in a pale gold glow, but the shadows between the trunks still looked cold. I stood on the porch, clutching a thermos of coffee I couldn't bring myself to drink, watching deputies unload equipment maps rolled into tubes, orange vests, GPS kits, boxes of bottled water. Everything had the sharp, purposeful energy of people who hoped they were already running late for a simple mix-up. Sheriff Harrow walked me to her cruiser and opened a large binder on the hood. Inside were topographic maps of the Bear Hollow area. Her finger traced the same trail Daniel had marked at our kitchen table days before, the ink on her map clean and clinical, where his had been soft and smudged. She explained that rangers were already hiking in from 2 angles, and that a dog team was headed to the trailhead. Her voice carried that careful steadiness I'd come to recognize meant to calm, but honest enough not to sugarcoat anything. When we reached the trailhead, Ethan's truck was still sitting there, dust settled on its hood, the morning sun warming the metal. Seeing it again hit harder this time. Yesterday it had felt like a puzzle piece. Today it felt like a warning. Deputies stood around it, speaking quietly, their breath faint in the cool morning air. A ranger knelt by the logbook, turning its pages with gloved hands. The smell of pine needles and wet soil rose around us, and somewhere in the distance a hawk screeched the sound sharp enough to make me flinch. One of the search dogs picked up a trail near the first bend, pulling forward with a sure, eager tug. The handler followed, radio clipped to her shoulder boots, moving quickly over the root-covered ground. I watched them disappear between the trees, the dog's tail swaying like a metronome, steady and focused. For a moment, hope nudged at me, a gentle, almost painful pulse. If the dog had a scent, maybe they'd find a discarded wrapper or a boot print, something small but real. Hours passed. Volunteers began filtering in neighbors, friends, people Daniel had taught or helped or waved to in the grocery store parking lot. Some carried old hiking packs, others just bottled water and determination. They gathered around the sheriff's truck, leaning in as she briefed them, her finger moving across the map while the breeze rustled the edges of the paper. The smell of dust and sun-warmed pine needles clung to everyone's clothes. I joined the group walking the lower section of the trail. The forest was alive with sound, cicadas, buzzing leaves shifting high above twigs, cracking under boots. But beneath all of it ran a quiet tension, a kind of held breath. Every few minutes, someone would call out Daniel's name, or Ethan's, the sound stretching into the distance before dissolving into the deeper hum of the woods. We checked ravines, scanned creek beds, looked under fallen logs and between ferns. The earth was soft from recent rain, but we didn't see the crisp imprint of fresh tracks. No heel, no tread. Nothing to tell us where they had stepped. Near midday, a deputy waved us over to a small clearing, holding up something pinched between his fingers. My heart seized for a moment before I realized it was only a torn piece of fabric blue, weathered, frayed along the edge. It fluttered weakly in the breeze, almost weightless. It didn't match anything Daniel wore. It didn't match Ethan's gear either. Just a scrap caught on a branch belonging to no one and everyone, the kind of thing the forest collects without explanation. Radio chatter filled the air as teams checked in. North Ridge clear, no sign along the creek bed. Dogs lost the trail at the outcrop. The last message hit me hardest. The dog's trail had vanished as if it had been swallowed whole. The handler tried to offer reasons, wind shifts, crossing game paths, but I could see the tightness in her jaw. Even the dogs seemed uneasy, circling the same patch of ground again and again before giving up. By late afternoon, the volunteers returned to the trucks, tired and dust-covered boots coated in red Arkansas clay. Some leaned against the bumpers, catching their breath, their faces drawn with worry. Others whispered among themselves. A few people avoided looking at me altogether, their eyes drifting instead toward the mountains as if the answers were etched somewhere along the ridgeline. Rumors spread quickly in towns like ours, quietly, carefully, but persistently. At the gas station, I overheard two older men murmuring about sinkholes along the old mining trails. At the diner, a woman swore she'd heard shots echoing from the valley days earlier, though she admitted she'd thought it was hunters. Someone else mentioned an old story about hikers getting turned around on Bear Hollow and losing track of entire days. Each theory came wrapped in nervous gestures, crossed arms, lowered voices, glances toward the floor. But the strangest whispers had nothing to do with weather or wildlife. A few locals claimed the forest beyond Bear Hollow had a way of confusing even seasoned hikers, that the land shifted after storms, hiding old paths and revealing new ones. One man, a retired logger who knew the area well, told me quietly that there were places where sound behaved wrong, where your own footsteps would echo back at you like someone walking behind. I didn't know what to believe. Fatigue had settled into my bones, making every breath feel heavier. Grief hadn't arrived yet, not fully. It was too soon, too unreal, but fear had taken its place. Not the loud, shattering kind, but a slow, creeping dread that curled along the edges of my thoughts. I kept replaying our last conversation, the warmth of his hand on my cheek, the steady tone he used when he said he'd be home soon. Those words felt fragile now, like something made of thin glass. As evening approached, Sheriff Harrow gathered everyone around the hood of her truck. The sun hung low, turning the dust in the air into a floating gold haze. She thanked the volunteers, told them the search would resume at first light, and assigned deputies to stay overnight near the trailhead. She kept her voice even, but there was a weariness in her eyes that hadn't been there that morning. I lingered near her after the others drifted away. The breeze carried the scent of cooling earth and the faint sweetness of crushed leaves. She placed a hand on the map, her fingers tapping lightly beside a marked ridge. She didn't say much, just that they'd expand the search radius tomorrow, bring in more dogs, check the steep gullies where water pooled after storms. But there was something in the way she kept her hand on that ridge, like she was trying to read something in the ink that the rest of us couldn't see. Twilight settled across the parking lot, the forest growing darker with every passing minute. The cicadas quieted, replaced by the deeper chorus of night insects. The last volunteers drove off their taillights, glowing briefly before being swallowed by the trees. Deputies checked radios, secured equipment, and prepared lanterns for the night watch. I stood a little apart from them, arms wrapped around myself against the cooling air, watching the shadows lengthen between the pines. The trailhead, which had felt familiar the day before, now seemed like the mouth of some great animal, open and waiting. The silence around it wasn't empty, it felt expectant. Then, just as Sheriff Harrow was preparing to leave, a deputy jogged toward her from the far side of the lot. His radio hung loose at his side, and he held something small in his hand. He didn't call out, didn't wave for attention. He simply approached with a cautious, measured stride, his eyes fixed on the object he carried. The sheriff noticed him and turned slightly, her expression tightening. And in the deepening dusk, with the last light slipping behind the ridge, I felt the air change, as if the forest itself were leaning closer, listening for what came next. When the deputy reached the sheriff, he didn't raise his voice. He simply held something out in his palm, his fingers curled around it like he wasn't sure whether to protect it or hide it. Even from where I stood, I could see the way Sheriff Harrow's posture changed. Her back straightened just a little. Her breath caught, and she glanced toward the tree line with a quick, assessing sweep of her eyes. A radio crackled at someone's hip, and the tone of the search shifted without a single word spoken. The air felt tighter, like the woods themselves were drawing closer. I didn't know what the deputy had found, but the unease rolling through the group told me this wasn't another false alarm. The sheriff motioned for a few of the rangers to follow, then turned to me with a look I'll never forget. Not pity, not reassurance. Something heavier. Something that said this might be hard to see. I followed anyway. My legs felt unsteady, but numbness carried me forward along the narrow path behind the ranger station toward the base of a slope where the gravel thinned into packed dirt and pine needles. The forest dimmed around us as the sun dipped behind the ridge, the temperature dropping just enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. We reached a small thicket where the deputy pointed to the ground. At first, all I saw was a patch of disturbed soil, darker and slightly sunken, surrounded by footprints from the search party. Then the sheriff crouched low, brushed away a layer of leaves, and the glint of metal caught the fading light, just a flash quick but unmistakable. She told the others to widen the perimeter. Their voices lowered, and the urgency in their movements sharpened. Someone called for marking flags, and bright orange stakes appeared in their hands like sudden flames in the growing dusk. As they cleared more debris, the shape revealed itself, a square metal handle bolted into the earth, half hidden by brush and carefully disguised with branches and loose dirt. A hatch. Not rusted, not ancient. Maintained. Used. My breath lodged in my throat. I stepped back without meaning to, my heel catching on a root. The cold air held a damp, metallic smell, as if the opening had been breathing out stale darkness and waiting for someone to notice. The sheriff knelt beside it, running her hand lightly over the edges. The metal was cleaner than it should have been. No corrosion, no loosened bolts. She signaled for two deputies. Together they pulled, and with a soft groan, the hatch lifted. A draft rose from below, cool, stale, tinged with clay and something faintly chemical. The kind of air that never sees daylight. A flashlight beam cut downward, revealing a narrow vertical shaft with metal rungs bolted into one side. 20 feet below, a dirt floor. And beyond that, darkness thick enough to swallow the light. For a long moment, no one moved. Even the radios were quiet, as though the signal itself didn't want to intrude. Then the sheriff said she wanted a controlled entry. No rushing, no unnecessary risks. She called for the county's portable generator and more lighting equipment. The rangers began staging gear near the hatch, headlamps, gloves, extra batteries. Every motion they made echoed that heavy shift in the air, the acknowledgement that we had crossed from a missing person search into something deeper, older, more deliberate. I stayed back as they descended one by one. Their boots clanged softly on the rungs, the sound growing duller the farther they went. The sheriff was last, her light touching each step before her foot followed. When she reached the bottom, her beam swept across the space, and her voice lifted just enough to say they had found a corridor. Reinforced walls, wooden beams, old rails from what had once been a mining shaft. When they moved farther inside, I shifted closer to the opening, staring into that shaft as if it might move. The cold coming from below crawled up my legs in a slow, steady creep. I could hear their footsteps echoing, a soft, rhythmic scuffing, swallowed quickly by the dirt-packed walls. Someone murmured they'd found an old box, the words drifting up like a breath exhaled in a church. A few minutes later, a deputy climbed up, carrying a small plastic container filled with items they'd collected just inside the first chamber. He didn't tell me to look. He didn't have to. The sheriff would have told him what to bring. Inside the container lay a hunting knife I recognized instantly. The handle was worn, smooth carved initials on the side. Ethan's knife. The same one that used to hang from the belt loop of his jeans when he stopped by our house. Seeing it lying there, stripped of its owner, felt like the floor tilting beneath me. I gripped the edge of the sheriff's truck to steady myself. The deputy waited respectful, his eyes lowered. My throat tightened. I didn't cry, not then. The shock came first. A vast hollow kind, like all sound, had been pulled out of the world at once. More items followed. A torn bootlace, empty cans of food with labels no older than a few months. A map pinned to a dirt wall with crude marks in red ink, the lines drawn steady, not shaky. The writing belonged to no one I knew. One ranger radioed up to say they'd found crude bunks, rough planks with blankets folded on top, not weathered, recently used. Each report floated upward from the hole like pieces of someone else's nightmare. But it was ours now. Mine. The sheriff emerged after nearly an hour underground, her clothes coated with dust, her face pale beneath the beam of her headlamp. She didn't speak at first. She just stepped aside, letting the others climb out, lifting gear after them. When she finally met my eyes, there was no soft tone left in her voice. Only truth. She said the tunnels extended farther than expected. Branching corridors, storage rooms, signs of recent activity, fresh footprints, containers of water that hadn't collected sediment yet. She didn't say the word camp. She didn't have to. The implication hung between us. Someone had been living down there. Someone organized. Someone who took care to leave no trash behind except what was needed. And somewhere in that underground maze they had found Ethan's knife. The sheriff didn't offer theories. She just told me they were closing the hatch for now and marking the site until a larger team could come in. She added almost quietly that this changed the shape of the search, that the woods alone weren't our only concern. I felt cold all over, as if the darkness from the shaft had risen through the soles of my shoes. The breeze stirred the tops of the pines, carrying the faint smell of moss and rain-soaked bark. The noise of the generators echoed off the trees, steady and low like a heartbeat out of rhythm. As they packed up evidence, a deputy approached carrying a small charred camera, its casing blackened, plastic warped, but the memory card intact. He held it like something precious and dangerous at the same time. One more piece of a story that was starting to form in shapes no one wanted to name yet. I stood beside the sheriff's truck, watching the lights play across the underbrush, everything touched by that dim orange glow. The sheriff called in additional units, her voice clipped and precise, marking coordinates, requesting backup. Deputies secured the perimeter with yellow tape. Flashlights cut through the dusk like thin blades. When I finally sat down on the tailgate to catch my breath, my hands were shaking so hard I had to press them flat against my thighs. The cold from the metal seeped through my jeans. I stared at the tree line, feeling more watched than alone. The night had settled, and with it came a kind of silence I'd never felt before, deep-layered, like the forest was holding its breath again. They closed the hatch, carefully covering it just enough to keep the rain out. But even hidden beneath the soil, it felt alive, pulsing with every secret it held. Eventually, the sheriff told me she had to bring me back into town, that there would be reports to file evidence, to catalog statements to gather. Her voice was softer again, but not comforting. More like someone carefully lifting a fragile object, knowing it could break at any moment. As we drove back, her headlights swept across the winding road, illuminating the mist rising from the creek beds. Every shadow felt sharper than usual. Every curve of the hills seemed unfamiliar, like the landscape had shifted while we were underground. At the station, the building glowed under harsh fluorescent lights. Deputies moved quickly through the halls, radios crackling, phones ringing. Someone brought in printouts of trail maps. Another carried bags of evidence inside. The air smelled of stale coffee and damp uniforms. The sheriff guided me into her office, told me I didn't have to talk yet, just sit. She stepped outside to brief a deputy. The door left slightly open behind her. Through the crack, I could hear someone say they were notifying the state, requesting structural engineers, asking for a forensic team familiar with long-term underground sites. Someone else mentioned the old correctional facility in the hills. Its records buried its remains unstable. Voices drifted in and out like fragments of a dream I didn't want to enter. I stared at the grain in the wooden desk, trying to anchor myself, my breath shallow and uneven. The sheriff returned and sat across from me. She didn't ask questions. She just said that what we found was only the beginning, that the night ahead would be long. And as the clock on her wall ticked softly, marking each second with a gentle click, I felt the weight of the discovery settle deep inside me, quiet, immense, irreversible. Outside, lights were being set up for a late-night press briefing. A camera crew stepped out of a van. Deputies closed the gates to the parking lot. Somewhere in that building, a phone rang with a sharp, urgent tone. I closed my eyes and let out a long, unsteady breath, knowing nothing in my life would return to what it had been before that hatch in the earth opened its mouth. The hours after the tunnel was uncovered passed in a blur of harsh lights, clipped voices, and the steady hum of engines that never seemed to quiet. Deputies moved with an urgency that felt strangely gentle, as if the weight of what they'd found demanded both speed and care. The sheriff stayed close, her presence steady, grounding the room even as phones rang non-stop and the station filled with the sound of printers spitting out paperwork. I sat in a corner of her office, my hands wrapped around a paper cup of coffee that had long since gone cold, trying to make sense of the pieces falling into place. Every so often, someone would step inside to ask a question or clarify a timeline, but their voices felt distant, muffled by the shock still held tight in my chest. Word traveled through the community faster than any official report could. By morning, neighbors gathered in clusters on porches, their faces pale in the soft light. I could feel their eyes on me when I stepped outside the sheriff's office to breathe, not out of curiosity, but out of that quiet concern small towns never try to hide. My sister met me at the curb, her arms wrapping around me before I could say a word. She had driven through the night as soon as she heard her hair still tangled from the road, her face drawn with worry. She didn't ask what they found. She didn't have to. She could read it in the way I kept staring at the pavement, as if the ground could hold me upright when nothing else could. The state investigators arrived by midday, their unmarked trucks lined up in front of the station, men and women stepping out with folders tucked under their arms and expressions that gave nothing away. They brought engineers to examine the tunnels and specialists who knew how to map underground structures. The sheriff briefed them before they drove back into the hills. I stayed behind this time at her insistence because what they were about to do required precision, not grieving eyes watching from the edges. It took 2 full days before they emerged with their first formal statement. The tunnels were far more extensive than anyone expected. There were signs of long-term habitation food caches, clothing tools, even battery-powered lamps that showed someone had been living down there well after Ethan and Daniel vanished. They found more scraps of gear that belonged to the men, items tucked away in corners as if intentionally sorted. But no bodies. No trace of where the men had actually gone inside those twisting passages. The official word was that they'd likely encountered a hidden encampment of individuals who'd chosen to live under the old mining structures. No names, no arrests, nothing that pointed to a specific group or purpose. The investigators said the tunnels were too unstable to continue exploring, too dangerous. They cited collapses, air pockets, and shifting earth. And once they closed the hatch, they ordered it sealed with concrete. A decision made for safety, they said. But I knew the real reason what lay beneath was bigger than any one discovery, and the state didn't want to risk losing people to a place that had already taken too much. Ethan's parents came to town after the announcement. Standing beside them in the sheriff's office was one of the hardest moments of my life. His mother held the knife they'd recovered, wrapped in evidence plastic, and pressed it against her chest like she could feel his hand through the layers. His father stayed stiff, jaw clenched, his grief shaped into silence. They thanked the sheriff, thanked me for staying with the search as long as I did, but their eyes carried a devastation words couldn't soften. The official case was shifted to a long-term missing persons file. There were no suspects to arrest, no witnesses to question, no names to place into the report. Just hints of an underground community that had vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving behind only the faintest outline of its existence. The state said they would monitor the area, but over time their presence faded. Patrols grew less frequent. The urgency dulled under newer responsibilities and fresher cases. Life in our little town tried to move forward. People returned to their routines, but something was different in the way they greeted each other at the post office or paused before heading into the deeper trails. The woods around Bear Hollow, once a place of weekend hikes and picnics, took on a hush that didn't lift. Parents kept their kids closer. Hunters moved in groups instead of alone. Even the forest itself seemed to change quieter, as if it remembered what we'd found there and didn't want to disturb the memory. I tried going back to teaching after a while, thinking structure might help settle the constant ache beneath my ribs. But every time I passed a window and saw the line of pines beyond the schoolyard, something inside me tightened. I'd startle at sudden noises, quick footsteps in the hall, or the slam of a locker door. For months, I couldn't sleep through a full night. I'd wake to the sound of my own breath catching my mind, replaying that hatch, lifting the cold air rising from the darkness, the faint smell of earth and metal that clung to my clothes long after we left the site. Friends encouraged me to move away, start over somewhere new, but leaving didn't feel right. I needed to stay close to the place where Ethan took his last known steps, needed to understand that the land, beautiful and unforgiving, still held his story. Even now, I drive by the trailhead every few weeks, parking in the same dusty lot, watching the wind stir the branches. The path looks unchanged, but carrying the knowledge of what lies beneath alters everything. The sheriff retired 2 years after the discovery. Before she packed up her office, she handed me a thin envelope, several photos of the hatch, the marked map, and a copy of her personal notes from the night the tunnels were found. She told me she kept copies because some stories are too heavy to leave behind entirely. She said she still thought about the tunnels, about the people who lived down there, about the way they vanished without leaving a trace for law enforcement. Her voice softened when she said she hoped the seal would hold. But there was doubt in her eyes, the same doubt that lingered in mine. As seasons changed and the years moved on, the sharpness of those first days faded into something quieter, like the ringing that follows a loud noise never gone, just softened into the background of everything else. I learned that grief isn't a cliff you fall from once. It's a trail you keep walking one careful step at a time. Some stretches are easier. Some take the breath right out of your lungs. There are mornings when the air smells like rain-soaked leaves, and the memory of Ethan's laugh rises so sharply it feels like he must be standing just behind me. And there are nights when the wind rushes across the hills and I find myself staring into the dark, imagining those sealed tunnels and wondering if they're as empty as the state claimed. I don't pretend to have answers. All I carry is what we found, what we lost, and what refuses to fade. Every now and then, when the sun sets low and the shadows stretch long across the road, I see the forest the way I saw it that afternoon, the moment when the truth finally surfaced, cold and heavy as the air rising from the earth. And I know that no matter how much time passes, part of me will always be standing there listening to the quiet, waiting for a sound that will never come. If you're still here with me, let me know where you're listening from and follow the channel so these stories are never forgotten.